I knew my sister hated me, but I didn't know how far she'd go until she slid a birthday gift across the table and laughed. A DNA test. Maybe this will explain why you're another man's mistake, she said loud enough for every fork to stop midair. I swallowed the shame, mailed the kit, and waited. Months later, our family's estate lawyer requested an urgent meeting regarding Grace Ellington. My mother went pale. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. Naomi stopped smiling. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. They already knew what I was about to find out. There was no dramatic outburst. No tearful plea for validation. In my line of work, when a draft is fundamentally broken, you don't argue with it. You scrap it. I simply stood up, the legs of my chair screeching against the marble floor of the ballroom, a sharp, final punctuation mark on the evening. I picked up the glossy box, tucked it into my bag, and walked out. Behind me, the murmur of the board members and the clinking of crystal faded into white noise. I drove back to the brownstone in Beacon Hill, the structure that had always felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum of unsaid words. It smelled of old paper and judgment, a scent that had seeped into my pores over 32 years. My room was less a living space and more an archive. I didn't pack clothes or jewelry. I packed my laptop and the stack of red notebooks from the bottom drawer of my desk. These notebooks were my life's work, the only things in this house that possessed a pulse. For years, I had been the silent editor of my family's existence. To the world, I was Emma Ellington, the quiet daughter in the background. But within these walls, names didn't matter, only utility did. I polished their public image, redacted their scandals, and formatted their finances. I was the invisible ink that kept their story legible. But tonight, the ink had run dry. I had learned silence not out of fear, but as a discipline. It was a vault where I kept my true self safe from Chloe's criticism, from my mother's indifference. In that vault, I was strong. I was the writer, not just the copy editor. And tonight, I was opening the vault. I logged into the family's shared cloud drive. I navigated to the folder labeled Work in Progress. This was the aorta of the estate, containing the drafts of my father's unfinished novels, the manuscripts that kept the royalties flowing. I selected the folder. I didn't hesitate. I hit delete. Then I went to the backup drive and did the same. I emptied the trash. In less than 2 minutes, I had erased the family's future income. They wouldn't realize it for days, maybe weeks. But when they did, the panic would be absolute. I walked out of the house without looking back. I got into my car and drove north, toward the cabin in Vermont that I had bought under a pseudonym 3 years ago. It was a small place, hidden in the woods, a sanctuary of snow and silence. As I drove, the city lights faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the heavy darkness of the highway. I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. The DNA test in my bag wasn't a weapon against me anymore. It was a key. It had unlocked the door to my freedom. I wasn't running away. I was finally, after all these years, editing myself back into the story. The drive to Vermont was long and dark, the road stretching out like a black ribbon cutting through the night. My mind replayed the last 10 years, not as a tragedy, but as a line-by-line edit. I was reviewing the manuscript of Invisible Labor, the cost of being the good daughter, the reliable assister. For a decade, I had been the unseen engine of the Ellington empire. Chloe was the face, the influencer, the golden child who could do no wrong. But I was the ghost in the machine. I thought about the funeral of my father, Robert. Chloe had stood at the podium, weeping beautifully, making the entire service a monologue about her loss, her grief. Meanwhile, I was in the back, signing the checks for the flowers, the catering, the burial plot. I had managed the estate, paid the taxes, kept the creditors at bay. When Chloe's lifestyle brand imploded last year, a disaster of cheap manufacturing and bad press, who had cleaned it up? Me. I had quietly transferred $450,000 from my own savings to cover her debts, framing it as a bridge loan to the board so she wouldn't be humiliated. She never even said thank you. And then there was my mother, Catherine. She needed me to be the trash can for the family's negative emotions so Chloe could remain perfect. It's a classic narcissistic family system. The golden child shines, reflecting the parent's idealized self. The scapegoat absorbs the flaws, the failures, the shame. I was the vessel for everything they didn't want to own. My competence was a threat to their narrative, so they had to diminish it. They had to make me invisible. I remembered the consulting fees. Chloe withdrew $120,000 a year from the estate for creative direction. She never attended a meeting. She never read a manuscript. She just took the money and posted photos of her process on Instagram. I did the work. I edited the drafts, negotiated the contracts, managed the publishing schedule. And I did it for a salary that was a fraction of her allowance. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I hadn't just been helping them. I had been enabling my own erasure. I had financed the very people who despised me. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. The anger that rose in my chest wasn't hot or chaotic. It was cold. It was precise. It was the anger of a ghostwriter who realizes her name isn't just missing from the cover, but erased from the copyright. They thought I was weak because I was quiet. They thought I was loyal because I was there. They were wrong. I was quiet because I was keeping the receipts. And now, the bill was due. Back in Boston, the silence I left behind was shattered. Chloe and Catherine were spiraling. They had returned to the brownstone expecting to find me crying in my room, ready to be berated and brought back into line. Instead, they found an empty room and a laptop that was no longer synced to the cloud. I could imagine the scene. Chloe trying to access the manuscript folder to show a preview to a potential investor, only to find it empty. The panic setting in. The frantic calls to IT support, who would tell them the files were permanently deleted. But instead of introspection, instead of realizing they had pushed me too far, they escalated. My phone started buzzing with notifications. Chloe had posted a series of vague, tearful stories on Instagram. Betrayal by those closest to you hurts the most, she wrote over a black background. Family isn't always blood. She was already spinning the narrative, positioning herself as the victim. Then came the legal threats. I received an email from the board, drafted by Chloe. They were petitioning to remove me from the literary trust. The grounds? Illegitimacy. They were using the DNA test results, which they hadn't even confirmed yet, to argue that since I wasn't Robert's biological daughter, I had no right to manage his estate. They were attacking my biology because they couldn't attack my competence. Catherine left a voicemail. Her voice was icy, trembling with rage. You are stealing intellectual property, Emma. Those files belong to the estate. If you don't restore them immediately, we will have you arrested. You are nothing without this family. Do you hear me? Nothing. They tried to lock me out of the bank accounts. I got a notification that someone was attempting to reset the passwords. But I was ahead of them. I had already frozen the accounts, flagging them for suspicious activity. They were locked out of their own fortune. The lawyer, Thomas, called me. He didn't sound angry. He sounded weary. Emma, he said. They are playing dirty. They are going to drag your name through the mud. They are questioning your paternity to the entire board. You need to be prepared. I am prepared, Thomas, I said, my voice steady. Let them talk. Let them post. Let them dig their own graves. I hung up and looked out at the snow-covered trees surrounding my cabin. They thought this was a fight about DNA. They thought they could shame me into submission. But they didn't understand. I wasn't fighting for their approval anymore. I was fighting for my name. And I had the only weapon that mattered. I met Thomas at a diner near the Vermont border 2 days later. He looked out of place in his tailored suit, sitting in a booth with red vinyl seats. I sat across from him, not with tissues or a plea for mercy, but with a heavy canvas bag. They're going to destroy you, Emma, Thomas said, sipping his coffee. They have the board on their side. The DNA test, it's a powerful narrative. The imposter, a daughter stealing the legacy. It's a good story, I admitted. Chloe always did know how to spin a story. But she forgets one thing. A story needs an author. I reached into the bag and pulled out the first red notebook. I placed it on the table between us. Then the second. Then the third. A stack of 5 notebooks, their covers worn, their pages filled with dense handwriting. Thomas looked at them, confused. What is this? Open them, I said. He opened the top notebook. His eyes scanned the pages. He frowned, then looked closer. He flipped to the next page, then the next. His hand started to shake. This is The Winter Garden, he whispered. Your father's last bestseller. Look at the handwriting, Thomas, I said. He looked. It wasn't my father's sprawling, chaotic scrawl. It was mine. Neat, precise, editing marks in the margins. And look at the notes, I added. He turned to the inside cover. There, in my father's shaky hand, the hand of a man who had suffered a stroke and lost the ability to write, was a note. To Emma. My hands are gone, but my voice remains in you. Thank you for being the writer I could no longer be. Thomas looked up at me, his face pale. You wrote them. You wrote all of them. For the last 5 years, I said. Since the stroke. He dictated the ideas, but I wrote the words. I structured the plots. I edited the drafts. The legacy a Chloe is fighting for? It's not his. It's mine. Thomas sat back, exhaling a long breath. He looked at me with a new expression. Not pity. Respect. Fear, even. He realized he had backed the wrong horse. Chloe was the show pony. I was the thoroughbred. This changes everything, he said. This isn't an estate dispute anymore. This is an intellectual property war. Exactly, I said. I want you to set up a meeting. The urgent meeting they asked for. Tell them I'm coming. Tell them to bring the DNA test. Emma, Thomas warned. If you do this, there is no going back. You will destroy them. They tried to erase me, Thomas, I said, gathering my notebooks. I'm just correcting the record. I walked out of the diner, the cold air hitting my face. I felt like a soldier putting on armor. I wasn't the invisible editor anymore. I was the author of my own fate. And the final chapter was about to begin. The urgent meeting took place in the mahogany-paneled library of the brownstone. The room was designed to intimidate, filled with first editions and portraits of ancestors who glared down with disapproval. Chloe sat at the head of the table, triumphant. The glossy silver box containing the DNA test sat in front of her like a trophy. Catherine sat to her right, looking ill, clutching a handkerchief. I walked in and took the seat at the opposite end. I didn't say a word. I just placed my canvas bag on the floor next to me. Let's get this over with, Chloe said, her voice sharp. We all know why we're here. We have proof that Emma is not a biological Ellington. Therefore, under the terms of the original trust, she is ineligible to serve as executor or beneficiary. She pushed the DNA paperwork toward Thomas. It's all there. Black and white. She's a fraud. Thomas didn't look at the papers. He looked at me. Then he opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick document. Before we address the DNA, Thomas said, his voice grave. I must read a final addendum to the will. This document was executed by Robert Ellington 6 months before his death. It was to be revealed only in the event of a challenge to Emma's status. Chloe scoffed. What could he possibly say? That he felt sorry for her? Thomas began to read. I, Robert Ellington, being of sound mind, hereby declare that I have known for 30 years that Emma is not my biological daughter. I have known since the day she was born. Catherine let out a sob. Chloe froze. I chose to raise her, Thomas continued, reading my father's words. Not out of obligation, but out of love. And in the end, out of gratitude. Because while biology gave me one daughter, talent gave me another. Talent? Chloe spat. What is he talking about? The addendum continues, Thomas said. He looked up, meeting Chloe's eyes. Since my stroke 5 years ago, I have been unable to write. My hands failed me. My mind fragmented. The books published under my name during this period, The Winter Garden, Echoes of Rain, The Glass City, were not written by me. The room went dead silent. You could hear the dust settling. They were written by Emma, Thomas read. She is the ghostwriter. She is the voice. She is the true author of the Ellington legacy. Chloe's face crumbled. The smirk slid off her face like oil. She looked from Thomas to me, her eyes wide with panic. That's a lie, she whispered. That's impossible. He wrote them. I saw him in his study. You saw him sitting in his study, I said, speaking for the first time. You never saw him write. You never asked to read a draft. You just asked for the checks. Thomas pulled out a financial ledger. Which brings us to the second matter. The addendum explicitly states that the copyright to these 3 novels belongs to Emma. Furthermore, it orders an audit of the consulting fees paid to Chloe Ellington over the last 5 years. He slid a spreadsheet across the table. $120,000 a year. $600,000 total. Paid for services rendered to the publishing arm. Services that, we now know, were never rendered because you did not write the books. This is fraud, Chloe, Thomas said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. You have been embezzling from the estate. And since the money came from books that Emma owns, you have been stealing from her. Chloe stood up, shaking. I didn't know. I thought. You thought you were entitled to it, I said. Because you were the real daughter. Well, now you know. You're not the heir, Chloe. You're a debtor. And if you don't pay it back, you're going to jail. The power in the room didn't just shift, it evaporated. Chloe collapsed back into her chair, a sobbing, broken mess. Catherine stared at me, her eyes wide with horror, not at what Chloe had done, but at what I had done. I had shattered the illusion. Please, Catherine whispered. Emma, be reasonable. Think of the family image. The image? I asked, standing up. I picked up my bag. You can keep the image, Mother. It's worthless now. I walked to the door. Chloe screamed after me, a raw, animal sound of denial. She was a narcissist facing her own extinction. She had invested her entire life in the belief that she was superior, that she was special. Admitting that I, the scapegoat, the mistake, was the source of her wealth, the source of the family's fame, it was psychological suicide. She couldn't process it. So she broke. I am the real daughter, she shrieked. I am the Ellington. I paused at the door. You can be the Ellington, I said without turning around. I'll be the author. I walked out of the brownstone for the last time. The air outside was cold and clean. I left them in their museum of lies. I had my notebooks. I had my name. And for the first time in my life, I had the silence I deserved. 6 months later, the snow was falling softly outside my cabin in Vermont. It covered the world in a blanket of white, erasing the edges, making everything new. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth. I sat in my armchair, holding a book. It was a hardcover, fresh from the printer. The jacket was elegant, understated. And there, in bold letters, was the title, The Editor's Silence. And below it, for the first time, my name, Emma, last name. It wasn't one of the books I had ghostwritten. It was my own story. A memoir. A manifesto. The brownstone in Boston had been sold to cover Chloe's debts and the legal fees. Catherine had moved into a small condo in Florida, far away from the society that now whispered about her family's collapse. Chloe was. I didn't know where Chloe was. And for the first time, I didn't care. The DNA test results were in the fireplace, curling into ash. They had been meant to be a weapon, a final insult to prove I didn't belong. But they had liberated me. They proved I wasn't just a branch on their rotten tree. I was a seed that had fallen far away, and I had grown into something strong, something enduring. I ran my hand over my name on the cover. I wasn't another man's mistake. I was my own person. The silence I had kept for so long was no longer a vault to hide in. It was a canvas. And I had finally painted my masterpiece. Have you ever had to walk away from people who were committed to misunderstanding you? Tell me your story in the comments. And if you believe that character defines family more than blood, please share this video.